Addison gasped as she jolted awake from the nightmare. She was covered in sweat and shaking badly. She must have been making noise in her sleep. Naomi came running into the room, her blonde hair flying behind her. "What's wrong?" Addison was panting when she spoke. "It's them." Naomi sat on the bed and grasped Addison's shoulders. "What are you talking about?" "The Union," Addison said in a strained breath. "They know I'm alive, and they know I'm close." She closed her eyes as she tried to calm her breathing and bring her heart rate down. Naomi's face filled with concern. "Addie, it was just a dream, that's all." She pulled her hands away and sat back to give Addison some space. "Besides, how could they know? What makes you think they would still be looking after all these years?" Addison opened her eyes. "Trust me, they have." She threw her sheet off and climbed past Naomi, not caring in the least that she was stark nude. She went to the closet to put on some clothes before she started to pace absent-mindedly, her thoughts busy elsewhere. The Union never gives up on a lost member. "More like slave from what you've told me. They obviously haven't done a very good job," Naomi said. "If they were really serious about recovering you, they would have done it by now. They would have found a way." She stood and crossed her arms as she watched Addison pace. "Besides, you haven't had any run-ins with the members since your escape. That we know of. For all we know, they could be watching us both. There's no way of knowing if they've been around or not." "I don't think you really have anything to worry about." "That's easy for you to say," Addison scoffed. "You weren't there, Naomi. You don't know what that place and those things are really like," she said, pointing her finger accusingly toward the city. Naomi put her hands up in surrender. "You're right. I wasn't there, and I didn't go through the things you did," she said. She knew Addison had been through hell during her stint in the Union. "But you haven't seen them since you escaped." She put her hands up defensively again when Addison started to argue. "That we know of. As far as we know, you haven't had contact with any of them. I don't think it's likely they've located you after all this time. I mean, what are the chances of them knowing you're back in the area? And even if they did, what purpose would it serve? It's not like they would see you as a threat." "I don't know," Addison said. She stopped pacing and put her hands on her hips. "But I guarantee that if they do find me, they won't hold back." Naomi shook her head and glanced at the nightstand clock. She sighed. "Well, we're obviously not going out tonight." She motioned toward Addison in her shaky disposition. "So I'm going to go into work. I've got to get going so I'm not too late. We'll talk more when I get back, okay?" Addison nodded as Naomi rushed out of the room to gather her things for work. After a few minutes of pondering to herself, she heard Naomi leave the apartment, run down the stairwell, and out the front door. Addison frowned as she made her way out of her room. She walked through the hall with unsure steps. The nightmare about Brescia had left her feeling lightheaded. Never before had that cruel, heartless creature made an appearance in any of her dreams. Not even when she was first brought into the Union nearly 2 centuries ago. She decided to avoid sleep for the time being. Night had fallen once more, and she was anxious to get out of the apartment and into fresh air. She hated being confined, caged like an animal. But ever since that night in the park, she'd been staying inside during her free time. Walking the streets, even at night, meant the chance of running into humans. She'd done her best to avoid unnecessary contact with them. So far it had worked, but she was beginning to miss the freedom. Her footsteps were nothing more than muted thuds on the pavement as she walked the dark streets, the air warm and muggy. She passed countless ranch homes with meticulously manicured lawns and landscaping, a few with motion-detecting floodlights that blinked to life when she crossed their paths. The only sounds were those made by the chirping crickets and Addison's feet quietly thumping the sidewalk. A creek ran through the center of the town, a regular summer attraction for the locals, or at least that's what she imagined. Fishing and swimming, those were things that happened during the day. Now the creek quietly tripped and stumbled over its bed as it moved toward a faraway destination, showing no evidence of any daytime activity. It held its peace. Passing over the bridge, she left the outer lights of the homes behind her. While she could see relatively well in the light and the dark, she was at the point between the two where her eyes needed to adjust. Blinking to focus, she pulled a hand out of her pocket and rubbed her eye. A bother, isn't it? A voice from behind her broke through the quiet of the night. She stopped and turned, surprised she hadn't noticed someone behind her. How had she not heard the footsteps? No one was that quiet. And then there was that voice. There was something vaguely familiar about it. It was like she had heard it before, but the passage of time had dimmed the memory. The person stood at the center of the bridge, no more than 15 feet from her. She knew right away that it was a man, not because of his voice or his frame, but by his scent. She'd come across it many times throughout the years with different men she'd encountered. There was a familiarity in this particular man's scent, like a musk she'd forgotten long ago. He was silhouetted against the lit exteriors of the homes behind him, leaving Addison to only guess who he was. At first her thoughts jumped to Grayson, since he'd unexpectedly followed her home that morning. But the voice she'd heard was wrong, and she would have been able to hear him on a quiet night like this. As she took in the man's scent and searched her memory for his voice, her instincts took over, and she suddenly felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her breathing quickened and her muscles tensed. She recognized the reaction immediately. It was the animalistic fear one felt when a predator was near. She tried harder to focus on the mystery man now in front of her, but the harder she tried, the worse it got. If this man was a threat, she could easily defend herself. But since she didn't know for certain if this man was friend or foe, she could only stand there until he revealed himself. "Excuse me?" she asked, bewildered. The dark figure stepped toward her slowly. "I always had a hard time in fading light myself." He stopped 5 feet from her. "But I found closing my eyes when passing from light to dark helps tremendously." He stood with his hands in his pants pockets, waiting. Before she could respond, the light behind the man went out and Addison's eyes finally focused. She stopped breathing. At the sight of the man's face, the blood drained from her own, and her eyes widened in recognition. Siren, the man who had tricked her into the hands of the Union nearly 2 centuries ago. Tension gripped her body and her muscles screamed for release. After a few moments of standing there dumbfounded, her brain snapped back to attention. "You," she choked out when she regained her breath. If she weren't still recovering from the nightmare about Brescia, she would have been shocked to see her former mentor standing in front of her. Somehow his appearance felt oddly expected. The irony of the situation struck her, and anger seared within her chest. A scowl of hatred spread across her face as her hands balled into fists. "Impressive," Siren remarked. "After all these years, I thought you would have forgotten." His expression remained cool and calm. Addison couldn't contain her anger. She swung her arm out, her fist connecting squarely with his jaw. His head snapped to the side from the impact. Addison stood with both hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Siren turned to face her again. He pressed his hand against his mouth to check the damage. He pulled his fingers away, the tips covered in blood. "I deserve that," he said dryly. Another wave of anger rolled through Addison and she struck out again, grunting as she threw her body into it. Siren absorbed the blow to the other side of his face, this time staggering a step from the force. "And that," he admitted gruffly. "I didn't come here to fight with you, Addison." He looked her straight in the eye as the blood ran down his chin. He visibly prepared himself for another strike, but Addison stayed where she was. As much as she wanted to kill him, she needed to find out why he was there. That alone was the only reason he wasn't floating down the creek in multiple pieces at that very moment. Siren had found her. But how? "Then why are you here?" she demanded through clenched teeth. "If you think you're taking me in—" "No, that's not it," he quickly reassured her with an earnest expression. He wiped the blood off his chin and checked the other side of his mouth for damage, but found none. "I'm not here to take you in, but I'm not going to lie. They've been looking for you." Still furious, she was more than tempted to continue pummeling him until he was nothing more than a bloody pulp. Thoughts clogged her head as her mind raced to absorb what was happening, and a voice inside her kept repeating, "Kill him, kill him, kill him." The voice in her head screamed this command over and over, but a calmer voice at the back of her mind overpowered the screams. See what he wants. Find out what you can. With the help of this calmer, more sensible voice, she fought the urge to kill Siren. She would have to push her anger and hate aside to find out how he'd located her. And more importantly, she had to know what he wanted. The rational voice in her head won, and for the time being, she would listen to what he had to say. If he was of no more use to her when he finished, she would dispose of him. You're lucky I found you before Rain did. He moved to the railing of the bridge that overlooked the creek and waited for her to join him. The mention of that name made Addison's blood boil. The hate she felt for Siren didn't even compare. After the leaders of the Union, Rain was the bane of Addison's existence. Complete opposites, the two of them had always gone head-to-head while in the Union. Though Rain had also been abducted into the unit, she'd quickly gotten used to her existence as a vampire. There was no mistaking that she actually liked it, and for some reason had come to despise Addison for her qualms against the life. Addison had learned early on to watch her back. Rain had a nasty dark side and often used it against her. Now that she was on her old enemy's radar again, she felt the weight on her shoulders grow heavier. The fact that Siren had been able to get so close without detection was sheer proof that Addison was getting sloppy. If she hadn't been so distracted lately, she might have seen this coming. Rain. She said the name under her breath like a curse and shook her head. She moved slowly to the railing and kept her distance from Siren. It was more for his sake than her own. I could have gone the rest of my life without hearing that name again. Siren's gaze moved out over the creek. She's always had it out for you, he remarked. But Brescia wasn't willing to write you off. She had teams comb the area for years trying to find you. When they heard about Hillsdale, they had their suspicions. Addison turned her eyes to the creek. The dream she'd had so many times since then flashed through her mind. His pale skin, his dark eyes. They stared at her, blaming her. They were right. Why did you come back, Addison? Siren's voice seemed almost somber. She stared blankly at the creek. I've been asking myself that same question for months. Then why stay? He asked, turning to look at her. We both know it's not safe for you. Believe me, she replied, frustrated that she couldn't answer the simple question. If I could leave, I would. It's just... She hesitated, thinking how she could explain the compulsion. Something drew me back. I don't know why, but whatever it is, it's strong. She turned her eyes to her hands on the railing in front of her. Until I can figure it out or overcome it, I'm stuck here. Siren's eyes were on her, trying to understand her words and measuring their worth at the same time. So, she said when she couldn't stand his scrutiny any longer, why are they looking for me again? They never stopped, he replied blandly. It's just become more of a priority now. They must not like loose ends. Not exactly. He turned his attention back to the creek. They had plans for you, before you were even brought in. She frowned. This was news to her. What kind of plans? Your guess is as good as mine. They never clarified, just said it was strictly a need-to-know basis. And you being my mentor didn't grant you access? She raised an eyebrow. By the lift of his shoulders, she could tell he didn't understand it either. So you were just following orders, she said dryly. His eyes were focused on something farther down the creek, perhaps one of the willow trees with its leaves dipping into the quietly moving water. More or less. She frowned. What does that mean? There was an order to bring you in. They needed someone with a higher degree of control, he said solemnly. They both knew what the likely outcome would have been had a younger, less practiced vampire been put in charge of detaining her. She probably wouldn't have made it into the Union alive. She stared at him, her emotions blending together in a messy jumble. If you're not here to bring me in now, then what do you want? Pushing himself up from the railing, he turned toward her. To ask for your help. The Union has been targeting humans. Addison gave him a crooked sneer. In case it's escaped your notice, they're vampires. It's what they do. Siren shook his head. They're not out for blood. They've been recruiting. Heavily. She frowned again. How many? Enough to draw attention. The world may be oblivious to vampires now, but it won't be for much longer if they keep it up. Why would the Union be recruiting so many new members? Addison knew Brescia wasn't foolish enough to take that kind of risk unless the benefit was high. Turning too many humans at once was definitely a risk. So then what was the benefit? It didn't add up. Exposure would lead to chaos and the humans would fight back any way they could. Vampires weren't indestructible, and sunlight was the human's best weapon. How did Brescia expect to go against that? Addison couldn't see the point of such a move. So why come to me? The Union needs to be stopped before they expose us. When they suspected you were back in the area, I knew I had to find you before they did. She was puzzled. What could she do? I wouldn't have the slightest clue of where to begin, and even if I did, it wouldn't matter. I'm not going anywhere near the city. In the city or not, eventually they'll find you. You know that. Thinking it and hearing it said out loud didn't make the truth any easier to handle. Addison shook her head. You've got the wrong person. Siren sighed. Look, I can't take on the Union by myself. There are a few members who've resisted the brainwashing, but that doesn't mean they can be trusted. Addison scoffed. And you think I can? You hate the Union more than anyone I know. Hate what it is, what it does. And based on the welcome you gave me, I have a feeling you'd give Brescia worse if you had the chance. That's enough for me. Addison felt panic start to set in. He was taking aim at her morality. If she didn't put a stop to his pleading, she would get pulled into a situation that she wanted nothing to do with. Just because I hate the Union, and you for that matter, doesn't mean I want to go up against it. A common enemy doesn't make us allies. Our enemy, he said, putting weight on each word, is about to start a war with the humans. You're telling me you're going to sit by and let it happen? Her eyes widened in anger at his self-righteousness. How dare he accuse her of indifference? What am I supposed to do? Go knocking on the Union's door and kill all the vampires in my way until I get to Brescia? Of course not, he said, exasperated. But doing something, anything, is better than doing nothing at all. She stared at him as the idea of the impossible streamed through her head. No, this wasn't going to happen. As much as she'd like to see the Union get wiped out, she wouldn't get involved. He could find someone else. After a moment, she shook her head in finality. I can't. Siren stared hard at her for a few long moments before he finally nodded in disappointment. I understand. He glanced at the creek once more. If I were you, I'd think twice about walking any streets at night from now on. Teams have been combing through this area on a regular basis. Hillsdale's giving them reason to focus on the town, so you'll need to watch your back. I never stopped, Addison said grimly. He watched her for another long moment. Be careful. He turned back in the direction from which they came, intent on leaving. Addison felt her resolve vanish the moment Siren turned his back. All the guilt, worry, and hatred she felt in denying his plea for help boiled down to one thing she knew she would have to live with for the rest of her unnatural life. Regret. If what he said was true and she stood by and let it happen, then she was no better than the Union or Brescia herself. She swore under her breath. She didn't have a choice after all. Siren hadn't taken more than 2 steps when Addison was suddenly behind him. Unaware of her movement until it was too late, he wasn't able to block her attack. She quickly grabbed his arm and shoved it into his back as hard as she could, using her free hand to reach around to his neck. She placed her fingers at the base of his esophagus and pinched hard, cutting off his air supply. She'd learned the technique from Siren himself, but the defense against it hadn't been covered. She would consider the irony later. Right now, she just needed him to pass out. She didn't have to wait long. He struggled against her for a minute with his free hand, but it was no use. The more energy he used to defend himself, the faster his air supply ran out. With one last flail of his arm, he went down. She didn't waste any time getting on with her plan. She was making it up as she went. At a little over 6 feet, Siren weighed around 190 pounds. She got in front of him, positioned him how she needed, and threw him over her shoulder. She was finally able to use her true strength. With her captive on her shoulder, she checked her watch. She was surprised to see that barely any time had passed since she left the apartment. She had plenty of time to get back. Siren's unconscious body bounced with every step she took, making strained noises with every breath he dragged in. "I'm not done with you yet," she said.